Hello, I hope you're well. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is my October wrap-up video, and there is honestly something for everyone this month. I read fiction, I read nonfiction, I read classics, I even read a graphic novel, so it was a very varied reading month for me. Let's dive into what I read in October. So the first book we're going to talk about is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and this is the copy I read, hence all of the flagging there, but I actually bought myself this stunning copy. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I did do an entire video on my thoughts after rereading this book, so I'll put that in the cards for you. But suffice it to say, this is one of my favorite books of all time, and it is easily a 5-star read for me. If you don't know much about this book, it is a suspense novel with a lot of gothic trappings, which is why I thought that it would be a phenomenal read for October. As far as the plot goes, this young, inexperienced woman marries Maxim de Winter and moves into his gorgeous country estate, Manderley, and both his new bride, himself, and everyone kind of in their orbit is very much haunted by the memory of Rebecca, his first wife, and the Rebecca of the title. If you do watch the Netflix movie, just bear in mind that that is very different in tone from the book itself. The movie is much more of a romantic period drama, I would say, which there's nothing wrong with that, but this book, the source material, is much more of a suspense novel than it is a romance. So just keep that in mind if you're interested. But yeah, I couldn't recommend this book more highly. And now we have Smoke Gets in Your Eye by Doughty. This is a memoir of Caitlin when she's in her 20s living in San Francisco, and she decides to take a job at a crematory. I would say that this is not a book for anyone who's squeamish or a little faint of heart. It does go into some detail about the process of embalming and cremation and decomposition of the body, and there is quite a bit of gallows humor, but I actually really found this to be an interesting memoir because yes, it is Caitlin's recounting of these sort of foundational years in her life and career, but she also weaves in the history of burial rites and death from a historical and even an anthropological point of view, which made this book all the more interesting to me. And what this book really impressed upon me was that although it sounds rather callous, death has become as much of a business as anything else. She talks very candidly about the upselling of coffins and the fees that are tacked on for embalming and for making up corpses. And it was just really eye-opening to me because obviously death, I feel like, is still a very taboo subject. So talking about what happens when your loved one passes and then you have to go through this process of burial or cremation or whatever, it was just really fascinating. And I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. And now we have Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is a graphic novel adaptation by Damien, Duffy, and John Jennings of Octavia Butler's speculative novel. In it, Dana, a black woman, is repeatedly transported against her will to the antebellum South due to this cosmic connection between her and the plantation owner's white son. And in being a modern woman transported to this really violent time for black people as slaves on these plantations, she is witnessing these atrocities firsthand and is also a victim of them. So it's her grappling with all of the emotions and trauma, and I think it's supposed to be a story about generational trauma, the graphic novel is very, very raw emotionally. That being said, I neither hated it nor loved it, for what I think are a couple reasons. The first one is that in reading this, I kind of realized that I don't understand how to appreciate a graphic novel. I found that while reading this, I was either focusing on the text, so the dialogue and the exposition, and not the pictures, or I was focusing on the gorgeous illustrations and not on the text itself. I seemed to be unable to walk and chew gum at the same time. So it created a somewhat jarring and shallow experience for me, and I don't blame the book for that. I blame that on my own inability to read a graphic novel, apparently. But there was also the fact that I just did not connect with Dana. I found her very distant and just couldn't get fully invested in her character. So I did give it 3 stars. As I said, I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it either. So the next book is one that I actually read for Victober, and that is Gondal's Queen by Emily Bronte. And this was an interesting read, but I wouldn't necessarily consider it an enjoyable one. So it is a novel in verse, and it is the story of Gondal's Queen, hence the title, Augusta Geraldine Almeida. I believe that's her name, but I might be butchering it. It's quite a mouthful. Ugh, it is quite a mouthful. Anyone who loves her is struck down by tragedy. Like, they are killed in battle, they are exiled, they are assassinated. It's not an easy text to read. This is one of these texts and books that I would say would be great in an academic setting, especially if you were studying the Brontes or Emily in particular, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for leisure reading. It does feel a little bit disjointed, partly because Fanny Rochford is quite literally pulling together scraps of paper and organizing them to create this novel in verse. I did really enjoy parts of it. I really enjoyed seeing the prototypes for Kathy and Heathcliff popping up. So I did not give this a rating just because I do think that it would be unfair to. This does really feel like more of an academic read and more of a homework assignment. Unless you're really, really, really obsessed with Emily Bronte, then have at it. But that's where I stand on that one. So the next book is The Wake-Up Call by Adrian Wooldridge and John Micklethwait. And I listened to this as an audiobook. Full disclosure, my reasons for picking this were pretty shallow, and that was because Kristen Scott Thomas was narrating it and had posted it on her Instagram. That being said, though, I'm actually really glad that I read this. So the book, in a nutshell, is looking at why bad government in the West has led to the mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is really timely. This is definitely not a book that you want to read if you're looking to escape what's happening currently, but if you want to get a better understanding of what is happening around the globe governmentally, then I would highly recommend this. What was interesting to me was that it was looking at aspects of government that I hadn't even considered how that could have had repercussions on the handling of the pandemic. It looks at things like how civil servants in the West aren't necessarily paid well, especially in comparison to their counterparts in the East, that their jobs have been devalued, and what not having a civil service with well-paid employees can do. Yes, it goes into all of these real-world examples, but it also tries to give a solution. So the last section of this book is this theoretical chapter on Bill Lincoln, who is kind of an amalgamation of William Gladstone and also Abraham Lincoln, and this leader is party agnostic, but it goes through what aspects of these two historical figures would help produce a leader that would be able to kind of right the ship, as it were. I gave it 4 stars. I am really, really hoping that once this pandemic is in our rearview mirror, which I understand feels like it never will be at this point, but once it is in our rearview mirror, that they do a second edition of this that covers the entire scope of the pandemic, not just those first 4 to 5 months of it. I would be very interested in seeing this developed further. The next book is The Butchering Art, Joseph Lister's Quest to Transform the Grisly World of Victorian Medicine by Lindsey Fitzharris. And as always, I want to shout out a female historian. It took me 200 pages to realize that Joseph Lister is the man that the Listerine mouthwash is named after. And I was way too excited by that fact. In this book, you are following the career of Joseph Lister, a Victorian doctor who is really butting against the prevailing theories of how infection spreads to patients, which is poisonous atmosphere or miasma, by trying to encourage cleanliness in hospitals and medical clinics, as well as the use of antiseptics like carbolic acid to kill germs. What I think is so well done in this book is that you really do get this vivid portrait of what medicine in Victorian England was really like. You get a real sense of the grisliness, the filth, the pain. I mean, this was a time when doctors would go from one surgery to the next without washing their hands or changing their aprons. They were doing things quickly, like an amputation was done in 7 minutes because they didn't have anesthesia, so you needed to go quickly because your patient would be in pain. It was mind-blowing. Much like Caitlin Doughty's book, this is not one that is meant for squeamish people. It goes into a lot of gory detail, so keep that in mind. So yeah, this was a 5 out of 5 stars for me. I would highly recommend it if you're interested in the Victorian era, or if you're interested in the history of medicine at all. But yeah, and we have another Victober read for me, which was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Bronte. And let me just say, I think I might have a new favorite Victorian novel. I absolutely adored this. Helen Graham, the protagonist of the story, is just phenomenal and a woman after my own heart. This is about Helen Graham, as I've said, this mysterious widow who moves into Wildfell Hall in this neighborhood of busybodies who are trying to kind of figure out what her story is, and it turns out that she is living under an assumed name and has fled a rather disastrous and abusive / toxic marriage for the sake of her son. This is such a revolutionary text, and I can't imagine what it would have been like to be a Victorian woman reading this novel, because there is absolutely a commentary on marriage and women's roles in society on the whole. There seems to be this idea that Helen continually butts against as this independent and free-thinking woman, that she can find and seek autonomy, and that's what she does. She leaves her husband, who is a raging alcoholic, is earning a living for herself, and so it really does seem to pit these traditional ideas of a woman's place against this idea of women's independence. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So, okay. Next is Lady Killers, Deadly Women Throughout History by Tori Telfer. And this is one of those books that's kind of in that anthology comic-ish style where each chapter is chronicling the life of a female serial killer. I think it's 14 in total. I had a few quibbles with it. The first is that most of these biographies and women that are in the book are in the distant past. The most contemporary is in the 1950s, and I found that choice to be a bit weird, considering that the whole point of this book was really to say that, hey, female serial killers do exist, and they're not these weird grisly unicorns that people seem to think they are. But then it doesn't have any contemporary examples, and also because it is focusing on these women who are hundreds of years in the rearview mirror, a lot of what is talked about is speculative and based on rumors because the documents are so old, so shoddy, or there isn't all that much to go on. And so it still adds this air of mythologizing to these women's stories, which I thought the entire point of this book was to kind of obliterate that concept. There is also the fact that there are so many poisonings in this book. Like, could we, as morbid as it sounds, maybe shake things up a bit? Like, maybe throw in some other ways to kill people? It was just a lot of arsenic, like a ton of arsenic. So I did give it 3 stars. I enjoyed the fact in the end that I did learn about these 13 women that I had not previously heard about, and yes, they are cold-blooded killers, but I still found them fascinating. If you like true crimes, you might really enjoy this, but it just felt a little superficial to me in the end. So the last non-fiction read for October was The Ghost, A Cultural History by Susan Owens. This book is essentially a survey of the depictions of ghosts in art and in literature and theater in British history, basically starting from the Middle Ages and going up into the 2000s. I would say that this is much more of an academic read than it is a commercial book. I had deja vu to my senior thesis days with massive blocks of quotations from other texts. That being said, there were a lot of interesting moments in this book. I was particularly intrigued by how Susan Owens explains that religion, especially during the Middle Ages and around the time of the Reformation, impacted how ghosts were thought to look and why they existed. I thought that was pretty cool. I really enjoyed when they started talking about like ghost tourism in Great Britain, because I am definitely a ghost tourist who goes on ghost tours, so guilty as charged. Did I skim sections of this book? Absolutely. Am I allowed to say that on BookTube? Is that like a no-no? Even if it is, that's exactly what I did for certain sections that just did not appeal to me. One of my other issues or quibbles was that I really felt that the pacing might have been a little off. The last 40 to 50 pages basically cover the end of the 19th century into the 2000s, and it just felt like contemporary ghosts in Britain were glossed over. So it just felt a little bit rushed at the end. I ended up giving this 3 stars. So the last book for October was the read-along for Victober Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. I really did not enjoy this book when I first started reading it, to the point that there was a brief, flickering moment of contemplating DNFing it. I found the opening chapter, which apparently Charlotte Bronte's publisher told her to remove, really obnoxious. The curates were annoying. The misogyny in some of the dialogue was really cringeworthy, And to be honest, I didn't start to warm up to this book until the characters of Caroline and Shirley were introduced. This is a historical fiction novel, and that is because it is written during the Victorian era, but it is set quite a few years earlier during the Napoleonic Wars, so around 1811, 1812 in Britain. This is a time when industrialization is also kind of picking up steam, and in York at the time there are these mills that are undergoing mechanization and modernization, which is causing a lot of civil unrest because the machines are putting men out of work. But the plot itself, it largely revolves around Caroline Helston, who is in love with Robert Moore, and Shirley, who is in love with Robert's brother. It really is, again, another commentary on the role of women during that time period. This idea of the independent woman kind of runs through this whole story with the main female characters. Shirley is independently wealthy and is pretty opposed to marriage. There's Mrs. Pryor, who has a career as a governess and has been able to provide for herself and could feasibly live comfortably on her own earnings. And then you even have Caroline, who at one time is contemplating whether or not she wants to marry at all, and what life would be like if she too became a governess. So you really have these ideas of an independent woman being pitted against the more conventional notions of marriage. I would say that reading this after having read Anne Bronte's Tenant of Wildfell Hall, this doesn't feel quite as revolutionary. If you kind of look, I'm not going to tell you how either book ends, but if you really take a close look at how Wildfell Hall ends and then how this ends, Anne Bronte's ending feels far more feminist and revolutionary than this one does. I gave this 4 stars. It took me quite a while to get into this book because of certain male characters at the beginning. And since the end wasn't quite as feminist as I would have liked, that's the score I'm sticking with. So with that, we've now come to the end of my October wrap-up. I do hope that there was a book or two on this list that you've now added to your TBR. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe, and I will see you on next week's video. Bye!